All right, so we're gonna make a quick video. You know what time it is, a couple days before the next region drops, and we're gonna talk about Techter skills and things to think about once we get our hands on Stia. So we've got 4 skills to go through, but really 3, and as it pertains to wand and what I think is gonna be important, really 2. So let's get the trash out of the way first, and of course you probably guessed it. Long range, shift a D-band. Now, I believe what this does is instead of shift a D-band being a radius type aura, this is probably gonna do something like a cone. So people are either gonna need to be in front of you or behind you, but I'm probably in front of you to get the effect. So this is most likely something for Talus mains, if you exist, though I think overall Talus mains are somewhat of a myth, but unless there's something else that we don't know, because this article doesn't necessarily cover everything, this is something that I'm definitely going to skip. The fun stuff. Technique gauge amplify for your united compound techniques, or compound techniques for short. I know the JP and the global versions technically call them slightly different things, but essentially this is your weak element amplify for compound techniques. When attacking an enemy with a weak point attribute or that weak element or a technique, the gauge accumulation amount for compound techniques will increase. You can imagine this is the same thing for photon blast. Now, what is interesting and something that we are gonna need to pay very close attention to once all of this releases is whether or not this stacks with the force skill, which is exactly the same, except the name is compound technique amplify force. As we see in this article, if we take this to be truth for the time being, these are not main class skills. These are only locked down to both force and Techter weapons. So rod, talus, wand. So it'll be interesting to see if in fact they do stack. Going Techter force, you get additional benefits to build compound techniques. I want to get into some interesting tidbits about compound techniques in general, because this has some downstream consequences on some of our attack rotations. And I apologize in advance because I didn't cover this back in October when we got the update. Generally what you see in my videos is when I wave crash, I generally do what I call the wave crash cancel, which is after you land the first hit, you cancel into another wave crash, and then I go into my skip attack combo. Generally I do this just from a DPS standpoint, especially with wand lovers, where it's equivalent to Swift Smash, but it has other benefits like building compound gauge faster. Now, one of the consequences of doing these wave crash cancels is you're actually not being very effective at building compound gauge in comparison to where if you were to do a full wave crash. So instead of canceling it, you let the entire attack animation go through. The reason for that is there are 2 types of photonic furies that you may or may not have noticed or known about if you didn't really know what was going on behind the scenes in the data. But effectively, normal attacks do what we can call a normal photonic fury, while photon arts and counters, and I believe step counters, do what is called a strong photonic fury. From a damage standpoint, there is no difference, but from things like down accumulation, photon blast accumulation, and compound technique accumulation, strong photonic furies provide more values than normals. And I believe the difference is normal is like 36 per hit or per explosion, and strong photonic fury is 56. So when you do a full wave crash, you are doing more compound accumulation per second than you are if you were to cancel. Now, doing a full wave crash on paper is less DPS. The trade-off is, even though you do less DPS on paper, it is more PP efficient and you build more compound. And so just to kind of stress that point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a clip of comparing how fast you'll build compound gauge doing the wave crash cancel rotation versus a full wave crash rotation. And so I just wanted to call that out because that's one of those small nuances that until October really wasn't as important, but But now that canceling wave crash is that much easier, using the full wave crash and canceling when you want to wand parry or counter an enemy attack is something that you're definitely going to work into. Now that we've got these compound technique amplification skills, whether or not it stacks with force, that's another conversation. To get the maximum value, you're going to want to start using full wave crashes. You're going to want to start getting comfortable canceling wave crashes when you need to counter an enemy attack. Now, I will say this changes when you use wand levers. The difference in compound gauge accumulation from your wave crash cancels versus full wave crash is relatively a wash. So that is something also to keep in mind, that when wand levers is active, most likely the wave crash cancel rotation is still optimal. The one that we've known about for a while, just because we saw it in multiple headlines, is the wand element revoke pursuit. And so essentially what this does is that after hitting an enemy a certain number of times with tech explosions, and that's very important to remember, photonic furies essentially, an additional attack will occur when activating wand element revoke. Wand element revoke cannot be used when this skill cannot be activated. So, two parts to this. The first part we already know. When you have a elemental photonic fury or a wand element engaged, if you hold down the weapon action and trigger revoke, you will do a pursuit movement that looks to track the enemy and do an explosive attack. Now, the second part is that wand element revoke cannot be used when this skill is not active. What you're gonna see, and you might have caught this in some videos or even articles that had access to a Stia preview, we are going to get a UI icon for essentially wand element revoke. So what's gonna happen is that, like some other UI icons that we see, like the Partisan Volcraptor, once you use wand element revoke, that icon is probably going to go dark. And that is signaling that you can no longer use wand element revoke. That doesn't mean you can't apply element based on what we're reading, but that means that you can't use that technique again. You're going to have to build that back up using wand attacks that trigger a wand element explosion or a photonic fury. And so as you can imagine, the more and more you hit enemies with photonic furies, that UI skill icon is going to regain its color. And then of course, once it's fully colored like the other UI skill icons, you'll be able to use element revoke pursuit again. So this is interesting just because it's got somewhat of a cooldown mechanism. Before this, I had some theories of how you could use this if there wasn't that restriction, but now we know there's a restriction, so it's going to be interesting to see how restrictive this is or how powerful the pursuit attack is going to be. Are we going to get jet boot intensity levels of power? Are we going to be more closer to Braver Combat or Waker's Familiar Unison? I personally, if I were to guess, the build up to get another element to revoke pursuit is probably not going to be too crazy, for the simple fact that you can only build it up on photonic furies or tech explosions. So while we won't be able to use it in succession, I do feel like it's going to be something that we'll be able to use quite often. If I were to guess, I'd say it'll take 20 to 30 seconds on a single target to get a pursuit back. Of course, in mobbing situations, it'll come back much faster, similar to how we see things like Tricky Capacitor with Talus. Speaking of Talus, this brings us to our last skill, which is also a skill that is shared with Force, but there is no stacking because essentially these are the same skills. This is called Talus Sign Marking. And essentially when hitting an enemy multiple times with either a normal attack or the weapon action, will put a marked status on the enemy. Marked enemies will take more damage from techniques while Talus is deployed. And now I hate that phrasing. I don't know why they keep using that, techniques while Talus is deployed. That effectively means when enemies are marked, they'll take more damage when you're using elemental Talus PAs. So either you're going to do Converge Shot, which is your single target, or Spread Feather. Those are your Talus PAs. That is what it means when a Talus is deployed. This one I'm on the fence about. I think especially spending most, if not all, of the Kavaris patch as Techter fighter and really trying to understand the ins and outs of Talus, the conclusion I've come to is, unless there's going to be significant balance changes, which we don't know, we haven't seen, that's still on the horizon, it's not a single target weapon. It's really becoming the king of mobbing. And so when I look at this skill, I feel like this is going to be great in mobbing situations, especially when you have a weapon action, the Talus multi-rock, that can hit multiple enemies at the same time, essentially applying multiple marks, and then your Talus can do more damage. Could this be a gateway into bossing? Potentially. But I think that's going to be on what they decide to do from a balance standpoint. And a couple of headlines ago, Hero mentioned that outside of the updates in October, that there were going to be some weapons that were also going to be balanced again come in December, come Stia, or at least maybe somewhere around December. But they were very vague about that, and we still don't know. Of course, I would put my money that Wand and Talus would be on that list. So it'll be interesting to see if there are those other balance adjustments, potency, frames, so on and so forth. Is that also going to synergize and kind of attune the skills that we're already seeing? But other than that, that's pretty much it. Nothing else really to think about other than, how these skills are going to change your rotations. But really everything else is going to come down to the numbers. Once we get into the data, we see potency, we really see the frames and how these things work and how they build. We'll get a better sense of how this has potentially changed Wand for the better. I mean, it's probably changed Wand for the better, but it comes down to, is this going to allow us to solo content without having to optimize and min-max everything? Essentially right now, one of the weaknesses with Wand only is that unless you're putting significant time and investment into your gear, you will likely never be able to solo this content. And so that's really going to be the litmus test and the thing that we measure going into Stia. Not saying that, hey, we're going to be able to solo purples in 16 minutes like we've been seeing hunters and bravers and fighters do. But at least we are not nail biting and only having a couple of seconds left, which is the difference between completing the quest and failing. But other than that, let me know your thoughts, questions in the chat or in the comment section. And we've got about, 5 days left. So come Wednesday, Thursday, check back on the channel. We'll have more to discuss. Until then, catch you all next time.